So if this is your first time learning about the CAGED system, or if you've tried to learn CAGED before and you feel like things just aren't quite clicking yet, then this is the video for you. I've made a video on CAGED before on this channel, but it's like 30 minutes long, and I think for a lot of people, maybe that's just a little bit overwhelming. So today we're just gonna focus on the basics and the very core concepts of CAGED and why it is such an important system to learn. So what exactly is the CAGED system? Well, CAGED is an acronym, C-A-G-E-D, and each of these letters represents a different chord shape. And these 5 chord shapes serve as the foundation of just about every single chord on the entire fretboard, no matter how complicated. Now, there is actually a reason behind the order of these letters, C, A, G, E, and D. We're not gonna touch on it yet, but we will get there in this video. So as you can probably assume, these chord shapes are the C major, A major, G major, E major, and D major. And we can just look at these shapes as open chords as they are, just like this. C major, looks like this. Then we've got A major, looks like that. Next up, we've got G major. And there are a few different ways to play this chord. You can play it with that extra finger in there if you want, or this one. It's the same chord, it doesn't matter. Then we've got E major. And then lastly, we've got D major. It's important to note that we don't play the low E or A strings when we play this chord, like that. Now, these chords are not actually meant to sound good together. The point of this is to focus on the actual shape itself. And I think the easiest real world example here is to look at a basic bar chord, because when you play bar chords, you are making use of the CAGED system. So let's say we want to play a G major chord, right? We should be familiar with that chord and the way that it sounds. Well, what we can do is we can also play a bar chord version of that G major chord. It would look like this. Open, and the bar chord version. And we call this an E major shape bar chord because we are making an E major shape, and this is the whole idea behind CAGED. We're using that E shape that comes from CAGED to play a different chord, right? In this case, the G major. And the same thing would go for the A shape as well, right? Open C major, and I can also play a C major chord right here, making an A shape just like that. So the next logical step here is that we can play other chords using those other shapes. Obviously though, we have to play them as these weird, funky bar chord shapes. Now, I'm gonna show it to you just so that you can understand, but that's not really the point of using CAGED. It's more of a way to map out and navigate the fretboard so that in the future, you can kind of understand how scales and chords, triads, and all of that stuff fits together. So again, you don't have to be able to play any of these crazy shapes, but we're gonna take a look at the C major chord, and I'm gonna play it with all 5 of the shapes. And this is where we're gonna see why the order is so important, because as we climb the fretboard, the next shape over that is connected to the one before is in order of that acronym. So we're gonna go from the C to the A to the G to the E to the D. Okay, so C major chord like this. So that is a C major with a C shape, right? The next one up the fretboard is this one here. I like to play this chord like this, but this is an A-shaped C major chord. You can also play it like this. What comes next? Well, we've got G, okay? So this is, again, something that's very hard to play. If we play it like this, it's a little bit awkward. If I'm gonna use this, I usually just play it with the lowest 4 strings like that, but that is a G shape. We've got the E shape next. So right up here, we've got the E-shaped C major chord. And this is just a regular bar chord right there. And then connected onto this one, we end with the D shape, which is all the way up here. Okay, but we actually have to play this one here to get the full chord again. Bit of an awkward shape. I think if you are going to use this shape at all, your best bet is to just ditch this altogether and just play that little chord right there, which we would actually call a triad. So the next thing we need to talk about are the minor variations of all of these chords. And the whole point of these chord shapes, again, is not to play the whole shape. Eventually, you're going to get into something called triads, and triads come from all of these different caged shapes. So you're gonna be able to relate them back to these. So like I said, it's not about the full shape, it's about just knowing where they are and how they exist so that when you play stuff that is connected to it, you know why it's there. Okay, so minor variations, all we have to do to be able to play the minor variation is adjust one note inside of the chord. So if I go to my E major chord, for example, you probably already know this example. Okay, my major third in this chord is this note right there. If I just take my finger off, it becomes a minor third, and now I've got an E minor chord. So we'll go back to the C chord, and the minor variant of a C chord is pretty terrible. It doesn't really work that well as an open chord. It works great as a movable chord that you'll use later on, but in its open position, it's pretty terrible. It would look like this. You would have to have this one here, this one here, this one here, and this one, and we can't play that high E. So again, this one is very, very awkward. I don't like to use it at all, but all we've done is we've just lowered that major third into a minor chord. If I were to move this shape into a different position so that it becomes a little bit more usable, like let's say if I wanted to put it up here, I can play it as this little 3-note triad like this. That right there would totally work, and that is technically based on a C minor shape. As far as A goes, A major, you probably already know, A minor, right? It's a nice chord like that, and this one's totally movable as well. If I slide it up to here, it becomes a C minor chord, right? G is another terrible one in the open position that we don't really like to use because we can only really use those notes as soon as we get to the next string. We are all of a sudden playing a major third if we play it open, so we just can't do that. But as a movable chord, it does work pretty well. That would give us an A minor using the G minor shape. E, we've already covered, right? E major, E minor. If I were to move this to that G position, right? G major, I just remove this finger, comes G minor. Great movable, just like the A, the E and the A are great for moving around the fretboard. And then last up, we've got D major, and we can go to a D minor, right? This is a pretty decent open chord. The problem is if you start to slide it around, you still have to make that little bar, right? So I would just suggest using it standalone like this shape right here. You can slide it around and use it for different minor chords if you want to play it up on those high strings. Okay, so that covers all of the shapes. Now, when you go on to learn more advanced chords, literally just about every single chord you'll ever learn, each one is going to be based on one of these shapes. They're going to be taking one of those shapes and they're going to be tweaking it and making a variation of that shape to play some other chord. Now, this becomes overwhelming super, super fast. So what I want to talk about here is just how to view these chords when you are moving them and how to think about them and remember them. And what I like to do is I like to create a navigation note, and this is just simply the root note of each chord. I think it's very complicated to try and remember all of the intervals. So when I was talking about major and minor third, exactly where those are inside of a chord shape, it's really hard to remember. But it's a lot easier to just remember the root note position of each shape. And this is just the lowest note of each chord shape. So if I were to play a C chord like this, that note right there, the lowest note in the chord, is my root note, and it is the note that shares the same name as the chord itself. So in this case, this note right here that I'm starting the chord on is a C note. So what that means is if I start learning some of the note names on my fretboard, wherever I move that chord, wherever my root note lands, that is the name of the chord. So for example, if I were to slide this all the way up to the 7th fret, okay? Now, I would have to bar this to make it work and all of that. But if we're just thinking about the root note here, that note right there is an E note, okay? You don't have to have this memorized or anything like this. This is something you can work your way up to, but that's an E note. So what that means is if I play a C major chord shape in this position, I am playing an E major chord, okay? So to show you what I mean, if I played the barred version, right? Okay, that is an E major chord right there, using the C shape. Right? They're the same chord. Yes, they're using different octaves of the notes, but you kind of see where I'm going with this. So the same thing happens when we use bar chords, right? So kind of makes sense. The next one we're going to talk about is A. So when I'm moving my A shape around, I need to look for that root note. And when we play an A major chord, what is the lowest note in the chord? What is the root note of that A major chord? It's an A note, and it's this open A string. So when I go to move this into a bar chord, right, and I move this anywhere, let's say we move it to the 5th fret, well, what note is the 5th fret here? What is the root note of this chord when it's in this position? Well, that right there is a D note. That means that when I play this version of my A major chord with the bar, I'm playing a D major chord using the A shape of CAGED. And obviously all of this stuff is the same for the minor shapes. If I were to just make the adjustment to make that an A minor shape, well, now I'm just playing a D minor chord, right? Because again, it's all about the root note. We're not worrying about all the other notes and what their names are. We're just focusing, totally laser focusing on that root note. Now we get to the G shape, and when we play a G major chord, lowest note, that's a G right there. So that means if I were to play this shape anywhere else in the fretboard, wherever that root note lines up, that is the name of that chord, that major chord. If I were to play the minor variation, it's the same thing. It's all about that root note. Now, again, the G kind of sucks for a lot of this stuff, but if I put it all the way up here, I'm only gonna do this lower string version because this is the most useful one that I found personally, right? What note is this root? That is a C note, the 8th fret of the low E. Well, now I know that that technically is a C major chord. I can tweak that for the minor variation too. I can do something like this. Again, playing that little 4-note shape. And because now we have that lower note, this is now a C minor. Next, we've got E. This one's simple, major, minor. This is our regular bar chords. If I slide it up to, let's say, the 9th fret, whatever note that is on the 9th fret, it is a C sharp or D flat. You can call it either C sharp major, or if I just remove that and make it a minor, we've got a C sharp minor. Lastly, we've got the D shape, and the root note for this one is actually on the D string, right? When I play a D major chord or a D minor chord, the root note is that open D string. So when I start moving this, it does become a little bit complicated, right? Because my root note is here, right? A little bit tough, but just for illustration's sake, if I make this shape here like this note right here is a G note. I don't expect you to know all the note names on the D string yet, but meaning that that is a G major chord. Just because I'm lining that up with the root note there. And I could make the tweak to make this a minor chord, right? And that would become a G minor chord using the D shape. A little trick if you are gonna use the D shape that I personally find to be a little bit more useful, because I'm usually not playing that lower root note in the shape, right? I'm not using this, I'm really just playing this version, right? There is another root note and it's on the B string there. So if you do happen to know the names of the notes on the B string, you can actually use this as your navigation note instead, right? That's a G. If I were to slide it up, that becomes a little A shape, right? Because that right there is an A note. Okay, so I don't want to go too much further than that. When you are first starting to understand CAGED, it's just all about understanding that there are these 5 chord shapes. They have both a major and a minor variation, and you can cover the entire fretboard playing major and minor chords using all of those shapes. There's one last tiny little thing that I want to show you, and it's one of the reasons why we use this as one of our navigation tools. If you were to look really closely as I play through the shapes, you will see that each one is actually connected to the next one. Every shape is gonna have a little bit that attaches it to the next shape up and the next shape up and the next shape up. So I'm gonna go back to our C major chord to show you this example. So if I play a C major, like that, right? Well, I'm gonna hang on to this note when I move to my A, right? I just hung on to that. Now the next chord is a G. So when I go up to the G shape, which I have to go all the way up there for my root note to line up with the G, for it to be a C, right? So if I go all the way up with my G like this, well, I'm still using that A shape right there, right? That's the A shape in this actual chord. Then what comes next? We've got E, right? Well, I'm gonna hold on to this and I'm gonna hold on to this. Just like that. We've got our E-shaped C major chord. Next, we've got our D, that's our last chord here, and it's all the way up here, but that root note is still connected to the E shape, right? And what's really cool is it actually just continues to cycle because this little D shape is attached to my C shape. We go all the way back to the beginning. And you can kind of see this if you look at this shape right here. Does it look a lot like this shape? Which is part of, right? It's the exact same thing. These chords just all connect to each other as they move up the fretboard. And as you start to dig a little bit deeper, which we are not going to do today, you're going to see that these overlay on top of the pentatonic scales, the major and minor scales. And then they're all connected too. So for both rhythm guitar stuff and soloing and lead guitar stuff, this becomes so important because all of a sudden you can start seeing these chord shapes all over your fretboard. So we're gonna stop things there before we get too carried away. And as far as next steps, I'm gonna give you two different options. One of those is to go through my longer form version of the CAGED lesson. So this one, again, is about 30 minutes long. It's gonna cover a lot of the stuff we just talked about, so it'll be kind of a good refresher, but then it's gonna take things a little bit deeper, get into all this CAGED stuff a little bit more. The other option is my lesson on combining the CAGED system with the pentatonic scale to create more beautiful solos. This one I would say is more in like the upper intermediate realm. You don't need a lot of knowledge on CAGED, but you do need to be able to kind of solo and play through scales and improvise a little bit. I'll put both up on the screen for you now if you want to check them out. If you want to help support the channel, you can actually get all the graphics and chord diagrams I made over on my Patreon as a nice downloadable PDF, or alternatively, you can check out my full-length guitar course, Listen and Play. There'll be links to all that stuff at the top of the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.